But secondly, as an RK, I don't know if anybody knows what an RK is. How about a PK? Anybody know what a PK is? You got a PK there? Oh, your wife's a minister, yeah. Yeah, PK, preacher's kids, right? There's a special deal there where you're supposed, you kind of have to show up for everything and be perfect. And, well, it has its challenges. Anyway, I always had to go to the Passover Seders. Now, the benefit was that I learned a great story. And I learned a story, the Exodus story, and I learned about the story of a journey from slavery to freedom. And at a certain point in the ceremony, they point to the children because it's a story told for the children to learn. That's kind of the point. Say, you were a slave in Egypt. I said, me? I've never been a slave and I've never been to Egypt. Well, what was the point? The point was that this story we were learning was not about a struggle that happened in one time in one place with one people, but is in fact a story that generation after generation has to be repeated and has to be retold. And for us, the retelling of that story was the civil rights movement in our country. And so for me, it was an opportunity to participate in a story with which I was already familiar. And finally, I just want to say that the civil rights movement was a movement of young people. You know, Dr. King was 25 when he led the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. And there's a reason for the connection of young people with movements for change. And it goes back to what I said about Brueggemann. You come of age with a critical eye, as you should, but almost of necessity, a hopeful heart. And that combination of a hopeful heart and a critical eye is what spurs change. It did in the 1960s, and it has in our country in the last 2 years with the Obama campaign and the role of young people in bringing about that transformation. I left Harvard after 3 years, went to Mississippi as a volunteer for the Mississippi Summer Project, worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That's where I got introduced to organizing. And it was a gift to be introduced to organizing there because it was very clear. It was very clear that we couldn't do anything about the symptoms of inequality without dealing with the source of the inequality. And the source of the inequality was very, very clear. The source of the inequality was summed up in one word: power. Political inequality, could not vote. Economic inequality, there were no unions allowed in Mississippi, right to work state. And culturally, I'd never had the experience of going to someone twice my age who would stand up, offer me his chair, call me mister, introduce himself with his first name and not look me in the eye because he was black and I was white. That was repeated thousands of times a day across the South. And you put together the cultural and the political and the economic, and you understand a little bit about the powerlessness that was at the bottom of all that inequality and inequity. So my first lesson was, you don't change these things without building power. But where do you go to build power? Some people said you go to Washington, D.C. And you go to Washington, you say, could we have some of your power, please? Thank you very much. Why don't you go do some more research? Why don't you testify for our committee? What we learned was that unless we found a way that the people who had an interest in change could be authors of the change, then it wasn't going to be real. It wasn't going to happen. And the bus boycott in Montgomery is the best example where we understood the difference between resources and power. And that many communities lack power, but they're not lacking in resources. And the challenge that an organizer faces is to translate the resources of a community into the power that it needs to get what it wants. The bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, everybody had one resource, and that was bus fare. As long as they used it as individuals, it got them nothing. It just made the bus company richer. What did it take to turn it into power? Using it together, and withdrawing it and revealing the kind of interdependency that underlies most systems of power and inequality in our countries. So that second lesson was that if you are going to do something about power, the people who need the change have to be authors of it. They have to be part of it. Finally, I learned that that doesn't just happen through sunspots or magic. It happens because there is skilled leadership that is working to make that happen. I say Dr. King, or say leadership and civil rights, everybody thinks Dr. King. Well, there were thousands of leaders in that movement, and they learned their leadership the same place he did, in the church. They learned how to get people together. They learned how to make decisions. They learned how to mobilize people. They learned the basic tools of leadership that it takes to enable collective action to happen. So that was the third lesson I took, was leadership development and training is a foundation for community building and for changing the kind of power relations that we need to change. I left the South after 2 years, went back to California where I'd grown up, and Cesar Chavez had just started a grape strike 30 miles from my home in Bakersfield. I'd grown up in the middle of the farm worker world, but I never saw it. I never saw it. I had to go to Mississippi and get educated about race, power, and politics in America to be able to go back home and see with what we called Mississippi eyes what I'd grown up in the midst of. People of color, no economic rights, no political rights, and of course California had its own history of racial discrimination and segregation since the turn of the century. So I began working with Cesar, did that for the next 16 years, up until 1981, and that's what brought me to Canada in 1968 and again in 1973. Left the farm workers in 1981, did another 10 years of union issue and electoral work, and then felt stuck and got invited to my 25th reunion at Harvard. Now, I'd never graduated, but Harvard's very smart. 25 years out, and they figure two things. One, you got a kid that you want to get in, and second, you got some money that you want to give them. And so I went to this reunion, but what it was like was coming into a conversation with a 20-year-old me who said, why don't you try to dig deeper and broader into what you've been doing all these years? So I got the idea of going back and finishing my senior year, which I did in 1991, and graduated class of 64-92. And my 81-year-old mother got to come, so finally her son was a college graduate and he was going to make something of himself. I then got the bug, went to the Kennedy School for a master's and then began a PhD in sociology and finished the PhD in 2000, was appointed to the faculty at the Kennedy School, and I was asked to develop a course on organizing. Now that surprised me. Organizing at Harvard? Well, there you go. But it was a real gift to me because it was a way to integrate my life experience with the social science I was learning in conversation with the rising generation. Every day I'd go to class, it would be a little bit like having a conversation with the future. And for my own learning, it was the most valuable gift that they possibly could have given. And I realized, of course, that I was just doing what I'd always done, and that teaching was just another form of recruiting, and that mentoring was just another form of training organizers. And I found myself, through my students, recruited back into electoral politics, particularly in the Dean campaign in New Hampshire in 2004. We learned in that campaign how to turn away from the marketing methods, the robocalling, the canvassing that electoral politics had become, to reconnect it back to the kind of organizing that it used to be. And so we learned, the canvassers became organizers. And we learned to turn that around through 1,000 House meetings, attended by 10,000 people, of 50,000 invited. And although it didn't overcome the scream from Iowa, it laid the foundation for turning New Hampshire from red to blue. And it laid the foundation for electing 2 Democrats from New Hampshire, and of course for an organization, Dean for America. Now, although that campaign imploded, the talented young organizers that were trained found their way to Barack Obama.